Nobody warned Jessica that babysitting for the apex predators of Sector 4 meant putting her life on the line. When two 300-pound, razor-clawed toddlers decided she was dinner, she didn't run. She tapped into a primal instinct older than the stars, showing the galaxy why humans are the real monsters. Brenda Wallace slid the sleek obsidian datapad across the polished steel desk. Her expression caught somewhere between deep sympathy and grim professionalism. I am legally obligated to tell you that you can decline this assignment without any penalty to your standing with Starlight Domestic Services, Brenda said, tapping her manicured finger against the edge of the screen. In fact, Jessica, I am personally advising you to walk out of my office right now and forget I ever brought it up. Jessica Miller did not walk out. She stared at the digital contract glowing on the pad. The compensation offered for a single evening of childcare was astronomical enough to pay off her family's relocation debt to the Earth Colonies Board and cover her younger brother's tuition for a full year. In the sprawling, neon-drenched metropolis of New Geneva, a central hub for interspecies diplomacy, credits were the only language that truly mattered. I need the money, Brenda, Jessica said, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. Just tell me what I am dealing with. Brenda sighed, adjusting her glasses. The clients are Audon and Diana Belmont. Obviously, those are their registered Terran corporate names. Their actual species designation is Rengari. They are the new diplomatic envoys from the Vexian expanse. Have you ever seen a Rengari in person, Jess? Jessica shook her head. Only in the holovids. They're the ones that look like a mix between a silverback gorilla and a saber-toothed tiger, right? That is a polite understatement, Brenda replied dryly. They are a class, 9 predatory species. Their entire culture is built on dominance, physical hierarchy, and the hunt. The Belmonts have twin boys, Toby and Wyatt. They are 4 Terran years old, which means they are currently in their biting phase. And by biting, I mean their jaws can snap titanium cables. Jessica swallowed hard, picking up the data pad. Why do they want a human babysitter? Surely they have their own caretakers. Because having a human servant is the ultimate status symbol in their social circle, Brenda explained, leaning forward. To the Rengari, humans are incredibly fragile, soft, squishy little creatures. They view us the way we view toy poodles. The Belmonts want to show off to the other envoys that they are wealthy enough to employ a Terran. The last 2 sitters we sent quit within 20 minutes. One of them is still in therapy for acoustic trauma. If you take this, you are walking into a den of apex predators who do not respect you. I can handle kids, Jessica said firmly, pressing her thumb against the biometric scanner to seal the contract. Even fluffy, terrifying ones. 2 hours later, Jessica stood before the towering, brutalist architecture of the Belmont estate in the ultra-exclusive Olympus Heights district. The front door alone was 15 feet tall, forged from dark, heavy metal that looked like it belonged on a battleship rather than a residential home. Before she could press the entry chime, the massive doors parted with a heavy, pneumatic hiss. Standing in the foyer were Aodan and Diana Belmont. Jessica's breath hitched in her throat. The holovids had done them no justice. Auden stood nearly 9 feet tall, his broad shoulders covered in thick, charcoal gray fur that shimmered with an iridescent sheen. His facial structure was frighteningly angular, dominated by a pronounced snout and 2 rows of serrated teeth that peeked through his upper lip. He wore a custom-tailored suit that looked almost comical on his massive, hulking frame. But there was nothing funny about the predatory intelligence in his golden, slit pupil eyes. Diana was slightly smaller, but possessed a sleek, coiled musculature that radiated lethal grace. She wore a diplomatic gown of woven crimson fibers, and her claws, each one the size of a human finger, clicked rhythmically against the stone floor. Ah, Auden rumbled. His voice was a physical pressure in the room, dropping into sub-bass frequencies that vibrated in Jessica's teeth. The Starlight Agency sent a replacement, and a terribly tiny one at that. I am Jessica Miller, she said, forcing her spine straight and maintaining eye contact, knowing instinctively that looking away from a predator was a sign of weakness. I'll be watching Toby and Wyatt tonight. Diana stepped forward, leaning down so her massive face was only a few feet from Jessica's. The alien smelled of ozone and raw oxidized iron. You are very brave, little ape, or very foolish. Our cubs are spirited. They are currently exploring their dominant instincts. Do try not to get severely injured. The paperwork with the Terran embassy is terribly tedious. I have extensive experience with childcare, Mrs. Belmont, Jessica replied evenly. Auden chuckled, a sound like grinding boulders. Childcare, how quaint. Toby and Wyatt are in the recreation atrium. We shall return at midnight. There is a panic room at the end of the hall. The code is 0001. Most of your predecessors found it quite useful. With a dismissive snort, the massive alien couple brushed past her, their heavy footsteps shaking the floorboards as they headed out to their diplomatic transport. The heavy doors hissed shut behind them, sealing the locks with a series of loud, echoing clicks. Jessica was alone. The sheer scale of the house was dizzying. The furniture was massive, built for giants, and the ambient temperature was kept uncomfortably cold. "All right," Jessica whispered to herself, dropping her bag on a small side table. "Just 2 kids. How hard can it be?" The silence in the Belmont estate was not empty. It was heavy, expectant, and thick with tension. Jessica made her way down the sprawling corridor toward the recreation atrium. The walls were adorned with mounted weapons and abstract art that looked suspiciously like battle scenes. As she neared the atrium, the silence was shattered by a loud crash, followed by the sound of tearing metal. Jessica quickened her pace, stepping into a massive, sunken room. There, wrestling over a mangled piece of reinforced steel that used to be a drone toy, were Toby and Wyatt. They were cubs only in the strictly biological sense. Each of them stood over 4 feet tall on all fours, weighing easily 300 pounds. They had the same dark fur as their parents, but it was patchier, spiked with the unkempt energy of youth. Their eyes were wide, glowing pools of amber, and their tails lashed wildly behind them. "Hey!" Jessica called out, clapping her hands together sharply. "Toby? Wyatt? I'm Jessica. I'm going to be watching you tonight." The cubs froze. They dropped the shredded metal toy, which clattered loudly against the floor. Slowly, in eerie unison, their heads swiveled toward her. They didn't look at her like she was a babysitter. They looked at her like she was a slow-moving gazelle that had just wandered into a lion's den. Wyatt, slightly larger and bearing a scar across his left ear, let out a low, clicking sound in the back of his throat. It was a hunting signal. Toby responded with a deeper, rumbling purr. They began to separate, slowly circling the perimeter of the room, flanking her. Jessica felt a cold sweat break out on her neck. "All right, boys, let's establish some ground rules. No roughhousing in the house, and we are going to put away these toys." She projected her voice, using the stern, authoritative tone that usually commanded respect from misbehaving human children. The cubs ignored her entirely. Wyatt lunged forward, swiping a massive paw toward her legs. Jessica barely managed to leap backward as the cubs dull, but heavy claws scored deep gouges into the hardwood floor, where she had been standing just a second before. "No!" Jessica shouted, pointing a firm finger at Wyatt. "Bad!" Wyatt chattered his jaws, mocking her. Toby used the distraction to leap onto a massive granite table, knocking over a priceless alien sculpture that shattered into 1,000 pieces. He stood on the table, looming over Jessica, and bared his double row of teeth. They were testing the hierarchy. In Ringari culture, authority wasn't given, it was taken. The human in front of them was small, had no natural armor, no claws, and no fangs. In their instinctual calculus, Jessica was at the absolute bottom of the food chain. For the next 20 minutes, it was a terrifying game of cat and mouse. The cubs didn't try to kill her, they were playing. But their version of play involved ambushing her from the shadows, snapping their jaws inches from her face, and herding her deeper into the center of the atrium away from the doors. Jessica was breathing heavily, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was backed against a massive structural pillar. Toby and Wyatt paced in front of her, their amber eyes locked onto her trembling form. They had grown bored of the chase. Now, it was time to establish ultimate dominance. Wyatt stepped forward, lowering his heavy head. He opened his jaws impossibly wide, revealing the dark, cavernous depths of his throat. He inhaled, his massive chest expanding. He unleashed the Rangari dominance roar. It wasn't just a sound, it was a kinetic weapon. The roar hit Jessica like a physical wave of pressure. It was a deep, guttural, low-frequency blast that rattled her bones, vibrated the fluid in her eyes, and overwhelmed her senses. Rengari evolution had designed that specific frequency to overload the nervous systems of their prey, triggering absolute, paralyzing terror. It was meant to make the prey freeze, give up, and accept its fate. Jessica's vision blurred. Her knees buckled as the acoustic shockwave crashed over her. She could feel the instinctual, biological urge to curl into a ball and submit. The cubs took a step closer, their eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of absolute victory. But as the deep, rumbling echo of the roar faded into the cavernous ceiling of the atrium, something else woke up inside Jessica. Deep within the human genome, buried under millennia of civilization, taxes, and diplomatic treaties, lies an ancient, violent code. When early humans were backed into a corner by beasts twice their size on the ancient savannas of Earth, they did not submit. They flooded their systems with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol. They fought back with a terrifying, unhinged ferocity. Jessica felt the fear burn away, instantly replaced by a blinding, white-hot fury. The fight-or-flight response had slammed aggressively into fight. She didn't cower. She didn't run. Instead, Jessica planted her feet wide. She threw her arms out, making herself appear as large as possible. She drew in a massive breath, filling her lungs to absolute capacity, and she screamed. But it wasn't a scream of terror. It was a roar. It was a raw, visceral, ear-splitting shriek of pure human defiance. Unlike the low-frequency rumble of the Rengari, Jessica's roar hit a piercing, dissonant high pitch. It was the sound of a primate going entirely berserk. The sheer volume and the jagged, agonizing frequency of the human scream acted like a sonic knife to the highly sensitive, specialized auditory canals of the alien cubs. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic for the Rengari. Toby and Wyatt physically recoiled, clapping their massive paws over their tufted ears. The high-pitched, sustained shriek was scrambling their equilibrium. To them, the small, squishy prey had suddenly transformed into an ear-shattering banshee. Jessica stepped forward, her eyes wild, her face flushed red with adrenaline, and kept roaring, putting every ounce of her frustration, fear, and survival instinct into the sound. She stomped her foot hard against the ground, advancing on the predators. The cubs didn't just back down, they broke. Wyatt let out a high-pitched, pathetic whimper and scrambled backward, his claws desperately searching for traction on the floor. Toby abandoned his aggressive posture entirely, tucking his tail firmly between his legs, and bolted behind the shattered remains of the granite table, whining in genuine distress. Jessica finally cut the scream off, leaving her chest heaving, her throat burning, and the atrium plunged into a ringing, stunned silence. The two 300-pound apex predators were huddled in the corner, staring at her with wide, terrified eyes, completely submissive. Unbeknownst to Jessica, the heavy pneumatic doors at the front of the estate had opened just moments before. Auden and Diana Belmont had returned early, having forgotten a crucial diplomatic datapad. They had walked into the foyer just in time to hear the Rengari dominance roar of their children. Auden had smirked, fully expecting to walk in and find the human unconscious or crying in the panic room. But then, they heard the human's response. The piercing, feral, unhinged shriek had echoed down the corridor, hitting the adult Rengari with the force of a physical blow. The sheer aggression and psychotic lack of self-preservation in that sound froze the blood in their veins. It was the sound of a creature that would gladly tear out a predator's throat with its flat, blunt teeth if pushed too far. Auden, a 9-foot-tall, decorated warrior of the Vexian expanse, stopped dead in his tracks. His fur puffed out in an involuntary fear response. Diana's eyes widened in sheer horror. She grabbed her husband's massive arm. Without exchanging a single word, the two towering apex predators slowly, quietly, stepped backward, hiding themselves completely behind the massive marble pillars of their own foyer, terrified to let the 5'4" babysitter know they had just walked through the front door. The heavy, suffocating silence inside the Belmont estate was finally broken by a sharp, authoritative snap of fingers. Jessica Miller stood in the center of the ruined atrium, her chest still heaving from the sheer force of her primal scream. She glared at the two 300-pound apex predators cowering behind the debris of the granite table. Toby had his massive paws over his snout, while Wyatt was aggressively attempting to blend into the shadows of the floorboards. "I am only going to say this once," Jessica said, her voice dropping into a deadly, eerily calm register that every human mother or seasoned babysitter natively possessed. "You are going to come out from behind there. You are going to sit on this rug. And you are going to look at me." Behind the massive marble pillars of the foyer, Audon and Diana Belmont stood completely frozen. Auden, a decorated military envoy who had personally routed pirate armadas in the Vexian expanse, felt a cold bead of sweat track down his thick fur. He raised his datapad, trembling slightly, and accessed the atrium's internal security feed to watch the impossible scene unfolding in his home. On the screen, his terrifying, aggressive offspring cubs that had sent hardened combat veterans to the medical ward slowly crawled out from behind the rubble. They kept their heads low, their ears pinned flat against their skulls, in the universal Rengari sign of absolute submission. "Sit," Jessica commanded, pointing a single, trembling finger at a circular woven rug in the center of the room. Toby and Wyatt sat. They moved with a synchronized mechanical stiffness, terrified that any sudden movement would unleash the wrath of the small, pink, squishy creature. "Now," Jessica continued, marching over to the shattered remains of the priceless alien sculpture, "you broke this. In a civilized house, we do not break things because we are throwing a tantrum. You are going to clean this up, piece by piece." Diana gasped quietly in the foyer, her razor-sharp claws digging into Audhan's expensive suit jacket. She is making them perform menial labor," Diana whispered, her voice laced with profound shock. "Audhan, she is treating them like Omega caste servants, and they are allowing it." "Look at her posture," Audhan murmured, his golden eyes wide as he studied the monitor. "She isn't exhibiting any fear pheromones. She is projecting total, unyielding dominance. I read the Earth Colony's board reports on human endurance, but I thought they were exaggerated. To flip from prey to apex alpha in 3 seconds. It defies biological logic." Back in the atrium, Jessica was entirely unaware of her audience. She handed Toby a large, intact piece of the sculpture, pointing sternly toward a waste receptacle. "Put it in the bin." Carefully. Toby, a creature capable of biting through structural steel, delicately carried the ceramic shard between his massive front teeth, tiptoeing across the hardwood floor to drop it into the bin. He looked back at Jessica for approval, letting out a soft, questioning chirp. "Good," Jessica nodded. "Wyatt, your turn." For the next hour, a bizarre, unprecedented domestic peace settled over the Belmont estate. The terrifying Rengari cubs were practically falling over themselves to follow Jessica's orders. When she sat on the large sofa, they sat at her feet, occasionally nudging her ankles with their wet noses to ensure she was appeased. That the tranquility of the evening was a fragile illusion, and it was about to be violently shattered. Deep within the estate's mainframe, a silent alarm tripped. The ambient lighting in the atrium flickered once, then died completely, plunging the massive room into oppressive darkness. The low hum of the climate control system spun down into silence. Jessica stood up, her instincts flaring. "Stay here," she whispered to the cubs. Before she could reach the wall panel, the reinforced glass ceiling of the atrium shattered. A shower of crystalline shards rained down as a figure descended on a repulsor cable, landing with a heavy, metallic thud in the center of the room. It was Garrett, a notoriously lethal mercenary operating out of the Boston quarantine zone. He was clad in heavy tactical armor, his face obscured by a tactical visor, and he carried a high-yield plasma rifle. He had been contracted by a rival diplomatic faction to infiltrate the Belmont estate and extract highly classified Vexian trade data from Aodan's private terminal. Garrett raised his rifle, the targeting laser cutting a bright red path through the darkness. He had timed his strike perfectly, knowing the Belmonts were away at a diplomatic gala. He hadn't accounted for the babysitter. "System override complete," Garrett muttered into his comms, stepping over the broken glass. He swept the rifle across the room, the beam catching the glowing amber eyes of Toby and Wyatt. Garrett chuckled, a harsh, metallic sound through his helmet speakers. Well, well, look at the little rich kids. Stay out of my way, mutts, and I won't have to turn you into expensive rugs." Toby growled, a low rumbling warning, but he looked nervously toward Jessica. Garrett's laser sight snapped over, finally illuminating Jessica. He paused, clearly confused by the presence of a human in the Rengery household. A Terran? What are you, the pet? Lie down on the floor, sweetheart, and keep your mouth shut. Jessica looked at the heavily armed mercenary. She looked at the plasma rifle. Then, she looked at Toby and Wyatt, who were huddled slightly behind her legs, relying on her for protection. They were monsters, yes, but for tonight, they were her monsters. The adrenaline that had spiked during the Cubs' dominance display flooded back into Jessica's system, but this time, it wasn't defensive. It was protective. "You're tracking mud onto the rug, I just made them clean," Jessica said, her voice deathly quiet. Garrett laughed. "Are you insane? I will vaporize you." He didn't get to finish the sentence. Humans possess a unique evolutionary trait that very few species in the galaxy share. Because early hominids lacked the heavy musculature of gorillas or the claws of big cats, they survived by mastering kinetic energy. Humans are the universe's most lethal, perfectly calibrated throwing machines. Jessica didn't hesitate. She didn't have a weapon, but her hand instantly found a jagged, 5-pound chunk of the granite table that had been left behind during the cleanup. With a brutal, practiced motion that channeled every ounce of her core strength, she pivoted and launched the granite shard. It was a textbook fastball. The heavy stone sailed through the darkness at terrifying speed, closing the distance before Garrett's brain could even process the threat. It struck him dead center in the visor with a sickening crack. The kinetic impact shattered the tactical glass, snapping Garrett's head back with enough force to lift him entirely off his feet. He hit the hardwood floor like a felled tree, TIE plasma rifle skittering harmlessly away into the darkness. He didn't move. Jessica stood panting, her arm burning from the throw. For a second, the room was dead silent. Then, a massive shadow detached itself from the far wall. Auden Belmont stepped into the dim light of the atrium, followed closely by Diana. They had sprinted from the foyer the moment the glass shattered, ready to tear the intruder limb from limb to protect their cubs. Instead, they arrived just in time to witness their 5'4" human babysitter neutralize a heavily armed corporate mercenary with a rock. Jessica spun around, her fists clenched, ready for another fight, only to realize the parents had returned. "Mr. Belmont," Jessica gasped, trying to smooth down her chaotic hair. I can explain. The alarm didn't go off, and he just came through the ceiling." Auden held up a massive, heavily muscled hand. He looked down at the unconscious mercenary, noting the deeply indented, shattered helmet. He looked at the heavy chunk of granite resting nearby. Finally, he looked at Jessica. Slowly, the giant Rengery diplomat lowered himself to one knee, bringing his terrifying face level with hers. It was a gesture of profound respect in Vexian culture, reserved only for equals and superior warriors. "Jessica Miller," Aodan rumbled, his voice lacking any of its previous condescension. "You stood between an armed predator and my children. You claimed dominance over them, and then you protected them. You have the heart of a warlord." Diana stepped forward, her golden eyes gleaming with a mixture of awe and fierce approval. She gently nudged Wyatt and Toby, who eagerly trotted forward to stand beside Jessica, flanking her like loyal guard dogs. "We deeply misjudged your species," Diana purred, looking at the broken mercenary. "The Starlight Agency said you were soft. Clearly, they do not understand the terrifying nature of Terran biology." "I just threw a rock," Jessica said, suddenly feeling very small and incredibly tired. "You utilized environmental weaponry with lethal precision," Audhan corrected, standing up and towering over her once more. "I will handle the authorities regarding this trash on my floor. You, Jessica, will be compensated, highly." The next morning, Jessica sat in Brenda Wallace's office at Starlight Domestic Services. The sun was rising over the neon skyline of New Geneva, casting a warm glow over the polished steel desk. Brenda was staring at her data pad, her jaw slightly unhinged. She took off her glasses, rubbed her temples, and looked at Jessica. "Jessica," Brenda said, her voice shaking. "I just received a transfer from the Belmont estate. It is a sum that exceeds the GDP of some small orbital stations. Not only did they pay your fee, but Auden Belmont also wired a warrior's tithe bonus. They also left a review. A review? Jessica asked, sipping her lukewarm coffee. Yes, Brenda read from the screen. Jessica Miller is a terrifying, undisputed apex predator. She conquered our airs through sheer acoustic dominance and neutralized an armed assassin with primitive kinetic strikes. We request her exclusively for all future childcare needs. 10/10. Brenda slowly set the datapad down. Jess, what exactly did you do to those monsters? Jessica smiled, thinking of the way Toby and Wyatt had curled up at her feet like oversized puppies before she left. She thought about her brother's tuition, now paid in full for the next 10 years, and the relocation debt that was entirely wiped clean. Nothing special, Brenda, Jessica replied, setting her coffee cup down. I just reminded them that humans might look soft, but when you back us into a corner, we always remember how to roar. Conclusion. If you enjoyed this thrilling sci-fi HFY story of humanity proving we are the real apex predators of the galaxy, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new daily upload. Share this video with a friend who loves incredible sci-fi twists, and leave a comment below on what alien species Jessica should babysit next.